I have always believed that the most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who scream and throw things across the room. They are not the ones who shout obscenities or pound their fists on tables. The most dangerous people are the quiet ones. The ones who smile sweetly at you over dinner while their hands move beneath the table, slow and deliberate, doing things you were never supposed to see. My mother-in-law, Vivian Caldwell, was exactly that kind of dangerous. She had silver hair she kept pinned back in a perfect chignon, a wardrobe that leaned heavily on cashmere and pearls, and a voice so smooth and measured it could lull you into a false sense of safety before you even realized what was happening. I had known her for 11 years. I had been married to her son, Marcus, for 9 of those years. And in all that time, I had never once caught her in anything I could point to clearly and say, there, that is the thing she did. That is the proof. She was too careful for that. Too practiced. But the afternoon of my daughter Lily's 7th birthday party, something shifted. Something cracked open in the careful architecture of Vivian's composure. And for one unguarded moment, she forgot to be invisible. I saw her, and everything changed after that. Let me start at the beginning, or at least at a beginning that makes sense, because the real beginning goes back much further than one afternoon in my backyard with pink streamers and a unicorn cake and 23 children running through the sprinklers. The real beginning goes back to the first time Marcus brought me home to meet his family, when I was 26 years old and so naively hopeful that I actually bought a hostess gift, a bottle of very nice Pinot Noir and a small potted orchid, because I wanted her to like me. She had looked at the orchid the way you might look at something a dog had dragged in from outside. She thanked me with exactly the tone of someone who was not thankful, and she set the orchid on the kitchen counter in a spot where it would receive no sunlight and be dead within a week. I noticed but said nothing. I was 26 and in love and certain that if I tried hard enough, if I was charming enough and warm enough and patient enough, she would come around. I had no idea that Vivian Caldwell did not come around. She simply waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. Her daughter, Delia, Marcus's younger sister, was cut from slightly different cloth, though the fabric of her character was no less difficult. Where Vivian operated in silences and subtleties, Delia operated in noise. She was the kind of woman who took up space aggressively, who narrated her own opinions as if they were facts, who had an almost supernatural ability to redirect any conversation back to herself within 4 sentences. She had strong views on how I kept my house, how I raised my daughter, how I wore my hair, and whether Marcus was truly happy. A question she posed to him directly, in front of me, on more than one occasion, as if I were furniture that could neither hear nor feel. For a long time, I handled both of them the way my own mother had taught me to handle difficult people, with grace, with distance, with a smile that revealed nothing. My mother was from a small city in Georgia and had grown up with a grandmother who used to say that your face was the one thing in this world you always controlled, no matter what anyone else was doing. Keep your face, her grandmother had said. Keep your face and you keep your power. I had internalized that lesson deeply. It had served me well in my career as a contracts attorney, where reading rooms and managing expressions was practically a job requirement. And it had served me reasonably well in my marriage, which was good. Genuinely good, I want to be clear about that, despite the complications that lived at its edges. Marcus was a kind man. He was not unaware of his mother and sister's behavior, though he underestimated it in the particular way that people who have grown up inside a system always underestimate it. It was the water he had swum in his whole life, so he could not always see it for what it was, but he tried. He took my side more often than not when things escalated. He set limits with Vivian that she respected about 60% of the time, which was, I had come to understand, about as much as anyone could expect from her. The 40% was what I managed on my own, quietly, with my mother's grandmother's advice running like a ribbon through my spine. The party that Saturday was one of those events that required genuine logistical effort. Lily had decided she wanted a mermaid unicorn theme, which was exactly as complicated as it sounds, involving both an oceanic color palette and the structural requirements of a 7-tier sparkle cake with a unicorn horn that had taken our baker 3 attempts to engineer properly. We had rented a small bounce house. There was a professional face painter named Gerald who was remarkably talented and whose patience with small children I found genuinely moving. We had made lemonade from scratch. Lily had helped squeeze the lemons herself the night before, her small hands pressing down with tremendous concentration, and I had set up a drinks table near the back porch with the lemonade, a pitcher of fruit-infused water, and a punch bowl of something I had made with sparkling apple cider and frozen raspberries for the adults who preferred a more festive option. Marcus was somewhere near the bounce house, supervising a rotating cast of 7-year-olds with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who loved his child deeply and also deeply loved silence. My own mother and father were there, seated in lawn chairs near the rose bushes, watching everything with the comfortable satisfaction of grandparents who had earned their right to simply observe. And Vivian was there, and Delia was there, which had not been my preference but was a non-negotiable reality of being married to Marcus. They arrived together as they usually did, Vivian in a pale blue linen dress, and Delia in something that was fractionally too formal for a child's backyard birthday party, both of them carrying gifts wrapped in expensive paper with complicated bows. I greeted them at the gate. I smiled. I kept my face. I directed them toward the food table and the lawn chairs, and the general direction of joy, and then I went back to managing the 17 other things that required managing. The afternoon moved the way good parties move when you have planned carefully, with a kind of organized chaos that feels festive rather than overwhelming. Lily was incandescent with happiness. She had her face painted as a mermaid by Gerald, and she wore a plastic crown that kept sliding down over one eye, and she shrieked with laughter in the bounce house and ate 2 full pieces of cake and got frosting on her dress and on Marcus's shirt, and somehow also on the face painter Gerald's left arm, and she was the most purely joyful thing I had ever seen. I was standing near the drinks table about 40 minutes into the party, refilling the lemonade pitcher from the big jug I had stored in the cooler. I was watching Lily chase one of her school friends around the yard, both of them screaming with the specific high-pitched joy of small children at full velocity, and I was feeling something that I can only describe as a specific variety of happiness. Not excitement, not triumph, but a deep and quiet rightness, the feeling of having made something good happen for someone you love completely. And then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw Vivian move toward the drinks table. This was not unusual. It was a hot afternoon, and the table was where the drinks were. I continued watching Lily. I continued filling the pitcher. But something, some old instinct sharpened by years of reading rooms and reading people, made me shift my gaze very slightly to the right, and I watched through that peripheral awareness that you develop when you spend your professional life in negotiation rooms, the kind of watching that looks like not watching. Vivian had picked up my glass. I should explain. I had set my own glass at the end of the drinks table, slightly apart from the others, because I had been coming back and forth to it all afternoon and I had been too busy to drink more than a few sips at a time. It was a tumbler with a faded floral pattern, one of a set Marcus and I had bought at a craft fair in Vermont 4 years ago, which I loved unreasonably and used constantly. There was no label on it, no name written on masking tape. It was simply there, in its slight separation from the other glasses, in the spot where I had been leaving it all afternoon, in a pattern that any person paying attention would have observed over the course of 40 minutes spent circling the same backyard. Vivian had been paying attention. Her back was to most of the party. She was angled just slightly, standing in a way that she had probably practiced. The way you practice a thing you have done many times before. The way you orient your body to create a visual barrier between your hands and anyone who might be casually looking. But she had not accounted for me standing at the drinks table at that particular moment, and she had not accounted for the specific quality of my peripheral vision, and she had not accounted for the fact that I was not, as she appeared to have assumed, fully absorbed in watching my daughter. I saw her hand go into the pocket of her pale blue linen dress. I saw her retrieve something small, a folded piece of paper, or perhaps a small packet. I could not tell precisely, but the motion was practiced and quick. I saw her hand move over my glass, fingers pinched together, a short, deliberate movement, and then I saw the hand pull back and the object disappear again into the pocket of the linen dress. The whole thing took perhaps 4 seconds. She had done it in 4 seconds, smoothly and without hesitation, and then she had reached for a different glass and poured herself some of the fruit water and turned back toward the party with exactly the expression of a woman who had simply stopped to get a drink. My body went very cold and very still. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular stillness that descends on me when something requires immediate and precise thinking. I had felt it in courtrooms. I had felt it in depositions where opposing counsel tried to rattle me. I had felt it in moments of professional crisis where the wrong response would have been catastrophic. I set down the lemonade pitcher. I kept my face. I did not look at Vivian. I looked at Lily, who was now sitting in the lap of her school friend's mother getting her hair braided, the plastic crown tilted at an even more extreme angle, her expression one of pure transported bliss. I thought very clearly about what I had just seen and what it meant and what the range of possible responses was. The first and most obvious response, the one that every nerve in my body was firing toward, was to walk over to Vivian and confront her directly. to say what I had seen, loudly, in front of everyone, to demand to know what she had put in my glass, to watch her face collapse under the weight of being truly, undeniably caught. But I thought about Lily. I thought about my daughter sitting 20 feet away having the best day of her 7-year life, with frosting on her dress, and her friends around her and her father nearby, and joy radiating off her like heat. I thought about what a scene would do to that afternoon, to that specific, irreplaceable afternoon. I thought about what it would do to the narrative going forward. Vivienne and Delia would spin it. They would call me hysterical, paranoid, dramatic. And Marcus would be caught in the middle of something ugly on his daughter's birthday. And whatever came next, whatever investigation or confrontation or consequence, would be muddied and complicated by the fact that I had made a spectacle of it in front of 23 children and their parents. I thought about all of this in approximately 10 seconds, and then I looked at the glass sitting at the end of the drinks table, and I thought about Delia. Delia, who had spent the last 4 years telling anyone who would listen that Marcus had made a terrible mistake marrying me. Delia, who had once, at a Christmas dinner I would not soon forget, suggested in front of 3 other family members that my legal career meant I didn't have time to be a proper mother. This said with such practiced casualness that you had to replay it twice before the cruelty fully registered. Delia, who had borrowed $4,000 from Marcus 18 months ago, and who had never mentioned repaying it, and who had looked at me with such naked hostility when I had, once, gently raised the subject with Marcus, that I had understood immediately she knew I was the one who had noticed. Delia, who was at that moment standing near the bounce house, talking loudly to another guest about something that was clearly very interesting to Delia, and somewhat less interesting to the other guest, who had the politely glazed expression of a person trying to remember how to exit a conversation. I thought about Delia. I thought about the fact that whatever was in my glass was presumably not lethal. This was a birthday party, not a murder plot, and Vivienne, whatever else she might be, was not stupid, but was intended to do something unpleasant. Cause illness, perhaps. Cause me embarrassment at my own daughter's party. Cause me to excuse myself and disappear inside feeling wretched while Vivienne and Delia circled Marcus in the way they had always circled him, slow and proprietary, reminding him of the gravitational pull of the family he had come from. And I thought, no. I picked up the glass. I held it naturally, the way you hold a glass at a party, easy and thoughtless. I crossed the yard toward the bounce house, and I smiled at Delia. It was my best smile. Not the performance smile I sometimes deployed in professional settings, but the warm one, the one that reached my eyes, the one I genuinely felt in moments of real connection. I had found, over the years, that this smile disarmed Delia slightly, because Delia had always expected hostility from me and warmth confused her. She tracked hostility easily and deflected it automatically, but warmth she didn't know what to do with. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw me coming, and her expression shifted through several registers before settling on wary pleasantness. The guest she had been talking to seized the opportunity and excused himself immediately, drifting toward the food table with the visible relief of a man who had been rescued. I said something about the party. I don't remember exactly what. Something light and genuine about how happy Lily seemed, something that invited Delia to share in a moment of normal human warmth, rather than treating it as an opportunity for competition. Delia, thrown slightly off her usual script, responded with something almost kind. She said Lily looked beautiful. She said it was a lovely party. And then I said, with the absolute ease of someone performing a perfectly natural social gesture, "You know, I just refilled this, but I actually need to run inside for a minute. Would you mind holding this for me?" And I held out the glass. And Delia, because she was off balance and because I had come to her with warmth, and because the request was the most ordinary thing in the world, took the glass. She wrapped her hand around it in the automatic way that people accept things extended toward them. She looked down at it briefly. She looked back up at me. I was already smiling. "Thank you," I said. "I'll be right back." I walked into the house through the back door and I stood in my kitchen for exactly 2 minutes, gripping the edge of the counter and breathing. My heart was going quite fast. I washed my hands at the sink, slowly, watching the water run over my fingers, feeling the specific quality of the adrenaline that was moving through my body. Not the panicked kind, but the clarifying kind. The kind that had gotten me through the hardest moments of my professional life. The kind that made the world go sharp and detailed and very, very clear. Through the kitchen window, I could see the party. I could see Lily, who was now back on her feet and chasing someone. I could see Marcus near the grill, laughing at something my father was saying. I could see Gerald the face painter making what appeared to be a small dragon on the cheek of a very serious little boy. I could see Vivienne, who had found a seat near the edge of the gathering, composed and watchful as always, except that I noticed, with my newly calibrated attention, that her eyes kept drifting toward me, toward the back door where I had gone, with an anticipatory quality, as if she were waiting for something. And I could see Delia, still standing near the bounce house, still holding the glass, and as I watched, she raised it to her lips and drank. She drank with the casual ease of someone who had not thought once about what she was drinking, and the glass was half empty by the time she lowered it again, and she immediately went back to scanning the yard for someone new to talk to, and nothing in her posture or her expression indicated anything other than a woman at a birthday party on a warm afternoon, drinking lemonade and waiting for the next conversation to begin. I went back outside. I circulated. I talked to the other parents. I watched Gerald finish the dragon on the serious little boy's cheek and start on a butterfly for the little boy's younger sister. I helped Lily blow out the candles on the cake, and I sang along with everyone else, loudly and without self-consciousness. And I watched my daughter's face glow in the light of 7 candles, and I took the photograph that would end up on my phone screen for the next 4 months, the one where she looks so completely and unself-consciously happy that every time I see it, I feel something expand in my chest. About 30 minutes later, Delia began to look uncomfortable. It was subtle at first, a slight distraction, a loss of the forward momentum she usually brought to her conversations. She touched her stomach once, very briefly, the way you touch something when you're checking in on it. She excused herself from the conversation she was in and walked toward the house, and I observed this with a careful blankness, and then I went and found Marcus. I told him quietly, with my eyes calm and my voice steady, that I needed to speak with him later, tonight, after the party, and that it was important, and that it was not an emergency, but it was serious, and that I needed him to trust me and wait. He looked at me with the particular attentiveness he brought to moments when he understood that I was being very precise about something. He said, "Okay, I'll be there." I kissed him on the cheek and went back to the party. Delia came back outside after about 20 minutes looking pale and slightly glassy-eyed. She found Vivian. I watched them speak together in low voices near the side fence, Delia leaning in with what looked like discomfort. Vivian's expression cycling rapidly through something I had never seen on her face before, something that moved from confusion to a sharper alertness, her eyes scanning the party, landing on me briefly before moving on. I was talking to my mother about the hydrangeas along the back fence. My face was entirely composed. My mother, who had known me my whole life and who could generally read me fairly well, said at one point, "You seem very calm for someone managing all of this." And I said, "I'm having a very good afternoon," which was true. It was, in its way, an extraordinarily good afternoon. Vivian and Delia left earlier than they usually would have. Delia cited a headache, which may or may not have been accurate. I genuinely did not know what the powder was. And I will say here clearly that I had thought through that question carefully and accepted that whatever discomfort Delia experienced was a version of what had been intended for me, and that this was a trait I was at peace with. Vivian said goodbye to Marcus with her usual composed warmth and said very little to me, and I said goodbye to her with my mother's grandmother's smile, the one that kept everything, that gave nothing away. And she looked at me, just for a moment, with something I had never seen in her eyes before. Not guilt. Vivian was not a woman who did guilt, but something else. A reassessment. A recognition that something had shifted, that the arithmetic of our 11-year dynamic had changed in some way she hadn't fully mapped yet. Good, I thought. Let her think about it. After the party, after the last guests had gone, and the bounce house deflator was roaring, and Gerald had packed up his paints, and my parents had headed back to their hotel, and Lily had been bathed and read to and tucked in with her plastic crown on the nightstand, Marcus and I sat on the back porch in the quiet that settles after a thing has been big and is now over. The yard was still scattered with the evidence of celebration. A balloon caught on a rose bush, some stray napkins, the ghost of the chalk drawings Lily and her friends had made on the patio. The string lights we had hung along the fence were still on, and they made the yard look like something from a dream. I told Marcus what I had seen. All of it, precisely. The motion of Vivian's hand, the angle of her body, the 4 seconds, the way she had moved away from the glass after. I told him about Delia, about the glass, about what had happened. I told him the whole thing in the exact tone I used for depositions, not emotional, not accusatory, simply sequential and factual, one thing and then the next. Marcus sat very still while I talked. His hands were wrapped around a glass of water, and he looked at the yard while I spoke, and I watched his face move through things he did not entirely try to hide from me, because that was one of the things I had always valued about him, that when something was real and serious he did not deflect from it, He sat in it, even when it was terrible. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps a full minute, which is a very long time for silence between two people. Then he said, "You're sure?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Completely." I said, "I've been working in depositions for 11 years. I know what I saw." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I'm going to call her." I said, "I know." He said, I can't." His voice stopped and started again. He said, "I don't have words for this yet." I said, "You don't have to have words for it tonight. We can figure out the words tomorrow. But I needed you to know." He looked at me then, turning from the yard to look at me directly, and his face was complicated in the way that faces are when they have been built on assumptions that have just been taken apart. He said, "Why didn't you say anything at the party?" I said, "Because it was Lily's birthday." He looked at me for a long moment. He nodded. He said, "What did Delia? Did she?" I said, "She's fine. Whatever it wasn't permanent. She seemed recovered before she left." He said, "Do you know what it was?" I said, "No." And then I said, "But we're going to find out." Because I had spent 2 hours during the party, in the scattered moments when I wasn't actively managing something, running through the legal architecture of what I had witnessed. I had been thinking about it the way I thought about contracts, identifying the clauses, locating the vulnerabilities, thinking about what documentation existed or could exist, thinking about what a reasonable next step looked like. I had not made any decisions yet. I had simply built the structure and identified the options, which was the thing I was good at, the thing I had been trained to do, the thing I did when I needed to feel less like a person in the middle of something frightening and more like someone who had a handle on the shape of the problem. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about what came after was simple. And I want to be honest about that because the narrative of this kind of story tends towards satisfying tidiness. The villain is exposed, the consequence is swift, the lesson is clear, and the reality was messier and slower and more emotionally complicated than any version of that clean resolution. What happened, in the abbreviated form, Marcus spoke to Vivian. It did not go the way he expected, because Vivian denied everything with the complete fluency of a woman who had been denying things for 73 years and had refined the technique to a high art. She expressed concern for Marcus, concern for our marriage, concern for the stress I appeared to be under, and Marcus, whatever his complicated feelings about his mother, had spent 9 years being married to me, and he knew what my certainty looked like, and he had chosen to believe me. This was the thing I had not been entirely sure about going in. I had thought, he loves his mother, but he also knows me very well. He knows how I see things, and I had been right. He had believed me. That mattered enormously. We had Delia tested. With her grudging cooperation, she was, in the end, more frightened by what had happened to her body than she was loyal to whatever Vivian had intended, and the results showed traces of a compound that had a reputation in certain wellness circles as something that could cause significant gastric distress in higher doses. It was not illegal to possess. It was available for purchase through various supplement channels. It was not, as I had assessed, intended to cause lasting harm. It was intended to cause a bad afternoon, an embarrassing afternoon, an afternoon where I would be quietly unwell at my daughter's birthday party while Vivian and Delia observed. The discovery confirmed what I had already been certain of, but it changed something in the family's dynamic in a way that no amount of my private certainty could have changed it alone. Delia, confronted with the fact that she had been the one who drank the compound intended for me, that she had been, in the clearest possible terms, collateral damage in her own mother's scheme, went through a reckoning that I had not predicted, and that I watched with something that was not quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. She and Vivian did not speak for 6 weeks. Vivian did not apologize to me. I had not expected her to. She was not a woman who apologized. What she did instead was something more subtle and more interesting. She began, slowly and with great care, to recalibrate. She was slightly warmer at the next family dinner. She asked about my work with what appeared to be genuine interest. She sent Lily a birthday card a week late with a note inside that was actually touching. Handwritten, specific. Remembering things about Lily that Lily would have been pleased to know her grandmother had noticed. I cannot tell you whether this was genuine or strategic. What I know is that the dynamic shifted, and that whatever invisible line had existed in the architecture of our family, the one that I had always sensed but could never name precisely, had been redrawn. The event had happened. We all knew it had happened, and the fact of our all knowing it changed the pressure of the space between us. My mother, when I told her the story several weeks later, was quiet for a long time and then said, "Your grandmother would have said you did that exactly right." I asked what she meant exactly. She said, "You kept your face. You kept your power, and then you used it." I thought about those 2 minutes in the kitchen, about the decision I had made in those 2 minutes, not from anger, not from revenge, but from something clearer and more precise than either of those things. About Lily's face in the light of 7 candles, incandescent, unaware, the most purely joyful thing I had ever seen. About the fact that I had stood in my own kitchen at my own daughter's birthday party and held the edge of the counter and breathed and thought, no, not today, not here, not in front of this. There is a version of this story where I am the hero. There is another version where I am simply someone who made a quick calculation under pressure and got lucky. What I can tell you is what I know to be true, that the woman I watched on the back porch that evening, talking to her husband in the quiet after a celebration, was not the same woman who had stood at that drinks table 11 years ago, trying to understand why her hostess gift was being regarded as an insult. Something had concluded. Something had also, I sensed, just begun. But Lily had had the most beautiful birthday party. She had woken up the following morning and told me it was the best day of her whole life so far, in the specific superlative grammar of a 7-year-old, which has a certainty and an absoluteness that adult language tends to lose. She still had a little face paint behind her ear that she had missed during the bath. She showed me the crown on her nightstand. She said, "Mommy, do you think I can have a mermaid unicorn party every year until I'm 100? I said, "We'll see, baby. We'll see." She accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a child who understands that parental ambiguity is its own kind of answer. And she climbed into my lap with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has no reason to doubt that this is exactly where she belongs. And we sat together by the window in the morning light, and I held her, and I kept my face, and my face was completely, entirely happy.